Welcome to the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust Child and Adolescent Autism Service webinar training on toileting and autism in collaboration with Sensations. So some aims for today's presentation are to help us understand the challenges toileting can pose for children with autism, and to identify some strategies and approaches that can be used to support children with autism in developing their toileting skills. So when we think about what are the difficulties that our autistic children may encounter with toileting, it is common for children with autism to experience some of these difficulties. So communication needs to be considered. So communication involves learning how to use the toilet. And when we think about this and how we usually approach it, it is typically associated with following verbal directions. And for some autistic children, they may not have this receptive level of understanding of what we say and what we're trying to communicate. So they may not understand the words, or they may take things too literally, or there may be too much information given to them, which can impact on their success when it comes to toileting and may present some problems. And they may not also be able to tell us when they need to go, or that they need changed, or that they feel that they need to go. In addition to this, there are some sensory needs that we need to consider. So for some children, there are interoceptive difficulties, which is being able to recognize and respond to the body's signals telling us that we need to go to the toilet. And that means that they may not be able to sense that their bladder or bowel is full, and therefore that can lead to some accidents. And thinking about the environment also, children on the spectrum can be sensitive to a range of sensory information that is associated with toileting. So things such as the smell of the toilet or cleaning products, the lights, the sound of flushing water, or hand dryers if we are in a public setting, the temperature in the room or the temperature of the floor or the toilet seat, as well as sitting on the toilet seat, and some difficulties with balance and coordination, and what we would sort of term as our vestibular and proprioceptive awareness. And alongside this, these children may seek out certain sensory information modalities. So for example, we may not be able to get our children to do their pees because they're so busy playing with the flusher. And a child might actually like the sensation also of having maybe a full nappy and see no reason to give that up. And some children also may like to experiment with their urine or with their bowel movement in a very sensory manner. So they might like to play with it also. For some of our young people, the smell and texture of their bowel movement may interest them. And when you combine that with a desire for sensory-based play, maybe with no conventional sense of what is dirty versus what's clean, this is how sometimes children then result and end up in smearing activities. And another thing to consider is that sitting still long enough to relax on the toilet to be successful can also be very challenging for our young people. Thinking then also about our preference for routine and rituals, which many of our autistic children present with. So a toileting program itself is a new routine, and children with autism can often resist this change, initially finding it very, very overwhelming. And alongside this, our autistic children tend to be coping with already higher levels of anxiety. So toilet training can ring and a lot of alarm bells for them. Anxiety and fear is another thing that we need to consider, which there may be a fear of using the toilet rather than the potty, or using a potty at all, because it's a brand new stimulus. It's a brand new thing introduced into the routine. There may also be fears of using the toilet in different settings. So if we think about using the toilet at home versus at school, or maybe in public settings such as restaurants or shopping centres. And our children may also have some difficulty then in adjusting their behaviour to new social situations and environments. So they may then withhold their bowel movement or their urine. And other children may then also struggle with things such as having cubicle doors opened or closed in public settings if it's not similar to what they've experienced at home. And if a child with autism is scared of a particular public bathroom, or if they have a preference for using a certain bathroom over another, they may then assign this fear or worry and become sort of afraid or scared of all public bathrooms, which may result in a reluctance to use the bathroom whenever they are out of the house. We need to also consider some difficulties that may arise from the young person's social awareness. So for some, they may not see the social impact of wetting or soiling themselves and how that may then impact on friendships or social inclusion. Where a neurotypical child may feel that fitting in with their peers or maybe being obliging to mum or dad or grandparents are all really good reasons to learn toileting skills. Sometimes our autistic children may not be swayed by those expectations, and they may also not mind the discomfort of being wet or soiled, meaning that often there may not be a strong physical motivation or a social motivation to toilet train either. And with no real sense of social pressure or uncomfortable underpants to bother them, they just may not simply see the point at that stage of their development. We also need to think about the nutritional concerns that may present as a reason for concern with children on the spectrum when it comes to toileting. When we think about the impact of diet that can have on bowel complaints such as constipation and diarrhea, that is especially true for many of our children with restricted diets, which may impact on that further. So to help, often increasing the amount of water and fluids can help with things such as constipation, and a lot of exercise or movement may help move things along. We also need to think about some motor coordination difficulties. So thinking about all of the things that are involved in being able to use the toilet and be able to toilet successfully. To get onto the toilet or a potty, we need to have some aspect of core strength, being able to stabilize our trunk while we're sitting. We need to have balance so that we don't fall off, as well as gross and fine motor coordination. So being able to pull your pants down, being able to get yourself onto the toilet, including things such as wiping, and being able to coordinate all of your actions to be very, very successful, which would all be falling under those motor planning skills. So when we think about the steps that are involved in toilet training, so in toilet training, two real goals need to be met in order to reach independence. So the first goal tends to be continence, and that's where the individual can recognize that sensation to go. And that would be linked to those interoceptive and sensory inputs that we discussed at the very beginning. And we also need to achieve a mastery of the chain of behaviors accompanying a visit to the toilet, which are really the steps involved. So when we think about all of the steps involved, if we look at the slide on the screen at the minute, we can see that there are quite a number of steps that a child needs to be successful with to be fully toilet trained. So this would be what is known as a task analysis. And a task analysis is what we use to break a complex skill such as toileting into very discrete and easily achievable steps. And using this task analysis, you can see which parts of the sequence maybe your child is at or where they need a little bit of assistance with, and which parts that they can do independently. The sequence may be fully prompted to begin with, but once they have achieved some sense of mastery over each step, you can fade the level of assistance each time. And we would also be using things such as graduated guidance, which may involve prompting the young person through the steps of the toilet training process, using the least intrusive prompts possible and increasing the level of prompting as needed. So the least intrusive prompts may be using a simple visual or a verbal cue. Sort of to increase the level of prompting, we may use sort of a touch to the shoulder, to the hip, maybe touching the trousers to remind the child to take them down, up to sort of the most intrusive and the most intensive level of support, which would be hand over hand. So you're doing each step of the sequence for the child and with them. But again, once the young person gains independence with each step, the goal is to begin to feed those prompts out very systematically, and so that they achieve a higher level of success by themselves. So when we think about when we want to start toilet training, this is a common question that we would hear from parents, and it's not really always a clear and easy decision to make. A good time to start toilet training, though, is whenever your child is displaying any of these behaviors. So we want to really be thinking about that your child is showing an awareness that they may need to go to the toilet, that they appear maybe distracted or fidgeting when they're wet or soiled, which would give us an indication that they don't like the sensation, which would be another good way to begin toilet training, or another good indicator. Your child may start to let you know when they need changing. so coming up and tapping you or indicating that they're soiled. It may also be if you've observed that your child is aware that they have started the process of maybe peeing or pooing, or that they finished it. So maybe showing a little bit of surprise on their face, or that they've maybe gone to the back of the couch and taken themselves off there. That would be an indicator that they're aware of something different is happening for them. If they've shown an interest in using or have used the toilet themselves without being prompted, so even things such as investigating the potty, investigating the toilet, and trying to get up on it may be another indicator that this would be a good time to begin toilet training. Equally, we want to make sure that your child is able to remain dry and remain free from an accident, sort of for 1 or 2 hours at a time, which would be an indicator that they have improved bladder control. An important point to remember, though, is throughout the day, your child's bladder slowly fills with sort of their pees as liquid is filtered through. And when a child is very young, that sort of leaks out quite easily and frequently, and they really don't have any control over this. As your child gets older, typically the bladder learns to fill a little bit before releasing their urine in one go. So when a child can hold the wee in the bladder for an hour or more, that would be an indicator that they have developed that muscle control needed to begin the toilet training process. So now that we've established what might be needed, we need to be thinking about then how we plan and prep for success. So we always want to start by changing the young person's nappy in the toilet or in a bathroom. So really we think about it, you can change a nappy almost anywhere these days, but we do need to start setting up the idea that we wee and poo in the toilet or in a potty. And this is where the action is going to be. So the whole action of getting your pants down, getting your nappy off, getting onto the toilet, the cleaning, all of those actions that are associated with that routine will be happening in the toilet. So it's important that your child associates that is the room that things happen, that it becomes the room associated with toileting. And the more consistently that's done, and consistently across adults, so sort of anyone's looking after your child, grandparents, aunties, uncles, the easier both the understanding and transition will be for your young person. We also want to show your child what happens. So we want to show them how the toilet seat works, and that it goes up and it goes down. We want to show them where their pees and poos go, as well as what the flush is for. And ideally, sometimes for very young children, it may be an idea to let your child see you going to the toilet. And we understand that you may feel embarrassed about that, but it may help act as a model if your child can see what happens and what goes where as part of that process. And we want to be doing all of these things before there's any pressure on the child to actually sit on the potty or toilet and do anything themselves. So what we're doing at this part is sort of trying to modulate and change the environment and set it up so the child associates these things with toileting. For many of our children, it's really important that we teach toilet-based vocabulary, so that they're going to need to know the names of everything that they will see and what they'll do. So we want to make sure that they have the correct words for wees, poos, nappies, pants, their tracksuit bottoms, flush, wiping, toilet roll, washing your hands. All of these things are really important vocabulary so that your child is able to communicate and understand what you are communicating with them. So it may be an idea to run a vocabulary check and make a little bit of a list of the words that your child needs. So for example, are they able to identify the toilet roll? Do they know where the bathroom is? If you say, let's go to the bathroom or the toilet, can they find that location? It may be an idea to practice a few games with them, such as going into the bathroom, pairing it with lots of fun activities. We also want to choose names for things that are going to work in the long run. So we want to try and teach the understanding of those words by saying them often at the right times of the day in everyday life. So if you're going to the toilet, just mention casually, just nipping off to the toilet, mommy's going to do her wee-wees, or whatever it is that you may cue your child in for. One thing that I would say, especially for our older children who are maybe experiencing some toileting issues and incontinence, is that it is really important that we don't make it about their age or their stage of development. So we want to sort of stay away from things such as big boys or big girls wear pants and nappies are for babies. Really what we want to do is set up the idea that pants are okay and that people who the child knows, loves, and trusts wears pants too, but we will always move at their pace. We don't want to embarrass or shame those older children who really haven't achieved this step in their development just yet. We also want to make sure that we choose the right clothes. So the right clothes need to be really easily sort of accessible for the child to get on and off them. So things such as jogging bottoms or a skirt that is easily managed may be ideal. And really why we're saying this is that we really don't want to miss the moment of successful toileting or getting your young person on the toilet because they're struggling with buttons or zips or belts or sort of knots in their joggers. We want to keep it really simple. We want to remove any barriers that are going to make this process any more difficult. When thinking about keeping that motivating for our young people, we may want to sort of maybe motivate them to wear underwear rather than a nappy by buying pants with their favorite cartoon or TV characters on them. For yourselves as a more practical idea, you're going to want to buy lots of pants and wash them a couple of times, maybe so they smell like your child's clothes if they have sensitivities towards certain smells or things being the same. And that will help remove that new or just sort of the packet smell that some of our young people find sort of aversive or not so pleasant. We also want to use backward chaining to teach new skills. So that's going to involve breaking the skills down into really small steps and teaching the last stage of the sequence first. So if we're thinking about how we choose the right clothes, if we're teaching your child to pull up his trousers or pull down his trousers, we would teach them the very last step. So thinking about pulling them up, you're going to teach him to pull up to his hips, and then he would pull them up to his waist all by himself. The next time you would pull them up to just under his hips, and he can pull them over his hips and his waist. That tends to be a really good way of teaching each skill because it builds on self-esteem, it builds confidence, and then they have taken that final step of the task then to complete that sequence by themselves. We also want to make sure that everyone approaches toileting in a really consistent way. So any equipment that you're using could be sent into nursery or school. So for example, a toilet seat that you may be using to make the seat smaller. If it's a toilet seat with extra handles on it, you may be sending that in to increase success. Thinking about sending in spare clothes, plastic bags to put any wet clothes in, as well as any wet wipes that you may be using. And also really important that we always have clear lines of communication between settings. So maybe something like a homeschool diary to share any concerns and successes is really important. And it's really important that we all view ourselves as part of a team, and that we need to agree that accidents, making a mess, or smells will not be really discussed in front of the child, and they'll just be really calmly cleared up. And on the other hand, maybe sitting on the potty or having a try, even if there's a few drops in the right place, will be really approved and reinforced. And we also want to be prepared for accidents. So accidents are going to happen as part of this process. Many of us have different tolerances for different smells and different types of mess. So depending on your preference, maybe get a few sort of items that you can use as a clear-up kit, and maybe place them strategically around the house where you know that your child spends a lot of time and an accident may be more likely to happen. So we also want to think about developing a routine. So many of our autistic children really thrive on routine and they like knowing what's happening. We can build on this desire for predictability to develop a successful toilet training routine. We want to set up a routine that means your child is regularly taken for a try-a-wee at specific times. So those would be times where you can schedule into the day where they can try to go to the toilet and do a wee in the bathroom. And this will help your child develop a nice relaxed understanding of what emptying your bladder means without any questioning, such as do you need to go to the toilet, especially if they're already engrossed in a preferred activity. And it can help form good habits of going to the toilet regularly and takes the pressure off remembering. For some of our young people, we might want to set it up on a visual schedule where they can see very clearly when toilet trips will happen. Or for other children, it may be a verbal cue or just sort of a timer where you can set a timer and every 15 minutes that it goes off, a little reminder goes for them to go and try to do some wees in the toilet. If you're really not too sure about what times to set up to do the trying or try a wee, sometimes that will actually work quite well within your average sort of day and school day. So it may be you try when you wake up, you might try again after breakfast. Maybe when you're in school, you might try before break time, after break time, especially after having consumed liquids, as well as before and after lunch. And then once they get home again, it may be before they do the bus or the car journey back to home, and again before tea time and after tea time, or before the bath, as long as there's a nice predictable way and that we can outline to our young people this is what the routine is going to be. For many of the children that we work with, they may need something a little bit more intensive with more regular scheduled breaks to go to the toilet, and that would be especially the case if they really haven't mastered being able to hold for more than 1 or 2 hours at a time. They may need to have much more frequent opportunities to practice going. And it's really important as well that we stick to very similar routines at weekends and holidays. So we're not breaking it just because it's a weekend or a holiday period. We also need to be realistic with our expectations. So what we don't want is for your child to sit on the toilet or potty for hours and hours on end. What we really want to do is pair this with lots and lots of positivity, that they associate it with a fun thing to try. So we're going to be wanting to try, and then maybe a couple of minutes of sitting, say, good try, well done, and continue with the rest of the routine that's associated with toileting. So they still wash their hands, they still dry their hands, and then they go back to playing. So what we really want to do is make potty training a really positive experience and celebrate the fact that they are trying. Some simple strategies that you could use may be counting to 10 while they're sitting on the toilet or the potty. You could use a sand timer or a time timer to indicate how long you need to sit on the toilet if their awareness of number is very limited, and a visual may be more appropriate. And even while they're sitting on the toilet, you could keep them busy by using some preferred activities. And it's important then to also keep the interactions with the toilet positive and upbeat. You could potentially isolate a preferred toy or activity that they get every time they sit on the toilet. And the minute they get off the toilet, then that activity ends. So it's always associated with using the bathroom. We also want to remember to be really considering the environment that we are trying to teach toileting in. We want to make sure that the environment of the bathroom is quite calm and relaxed, because we want to encourage independence and success when completing the routine and free from stress. It would be important then to remove all distractions which are not associated with toileting to help your child understand what is expected of them while in the toilet. So they've got sort of preferred toys that they play with in the bathroom, in the shower, maybe put them in a box and remove them just for that period of time so they're not inclined to jump up and try and get those toys. Think about, are you going to use a toilet or a potty? Some people prefer to go straight for the toilet, as this is what the end goal would be, and their child may find it very uncomfortable to sit on a potty, or maybe too big to sit on a potty. If you're moving to the toilet, there are ways to consider about making that more comfortable and making it a little bit more easily accessible. So you can think about using sort of inset seats for the toilet, which you can see on the slides. One, the top one has a step and 2 handles attached to it, which can help with getting up onto the toilet, but also with balance and that core control. The second one doesn't have any step, but it does have the handle still at the side and a nice cushioned seat to make it the toilet sort of the right size for very small people. And then equally, you can always use a step to help the child get onto the toilet. So we want to really encourage independence by ensuring that everything in the bathroom is at the right level for your child so that they can use it. We also need to think about the child's sensory needs and make changes to reduce anxiety as much as possible. So thinking about your own specific child, do you know that the soap or the general toilet or bathroom environment may smell too strong for them? If that's the case, we may be thinking about using unscented or a preferred scent of the soap. Maybe the extractor fan in the bathroom is annoying them. Can we switch that off? Can we play some calming music at the same time, or have another sound that's going on to make it a more positive experience? We also need to be thinking about, many of our young people run about in their bare feet, and then once they hit the tiles of the bathroom, it may be too cold, and that may also be a thing to consider in terms of their sensory preferences. So maybe just placing mats on cold tiles. And also really basic things that we consider ourselves whenever we're out purchasing things, but maybe the toilet paper, is it too rough? Is it the right texture? Does your child complain that they don't like the smell of it? And trying to find all of these things that may help before we even start the process. And also the lighting, is the lighting too bright, too dark, or is it just right? You've probably heard throughout quite a number of these training sessions that we advocate the use of visuals. And visuals are really important because they can help support transitions and alleviate anxiety. They can also help reduce the amount of verbal demands and commands that we're placing on young people. And that means that there are clear and effective communication strategies in place that the child can continually review what is needed rather than having to remember a list of instructions. And importantly, we may need to reteach a skill in a new environment. So just because your young person has mastered toileting at home in the downstairs toilet, some people find that they go upstairs and that skill is lost. So it's important to generalize the skill across a range of different settings so that they learn how to go to the toilet at home, at granny's house, at auntie's house, and in the public and in school. And that's when we think about communication. It's important that your child is able to communicate their need to use the toilet in a range of different settings. We also want to make sure that the environment itself is associated with being anxiety-free. So I mentioned a few slides back that we may want to begin with playing with a highly preferred item in the toilet to help your child associate that with a positive experience. And once they've associated just being in the room, then you can use that item for playing with them when they're on the toilet so as it continues to be very positive. And like I said, it is important where possible to restrict access to that item for toilet time only so as that it continues to have a high level of reinforcement and motivation. So we have some examples of visual supports that you may wish to use with your child. So we may think about a visual sequence, and those are pictures that will help your child learn the routine and help them understand what is expected of them at each step and what is going to happen at each step. And these visual sequences can really support transitions and alleviate any anxiety that your young person may have about what's going to happen next. So if you look at the one that is mostly picture-based, the one without the numbers on it, you will see that that is a nice, clear visual going from left to right and then top to bottom. And it shows the child each of the steps that is involved in going to the toilet. We also want to be thinking about using rewards and incentives. So this is an example of a reward chart that could be used to help motivate your child during toilet training or desensitization to the toilet. So the most common type of reinforcement used is a preferred activity or food following urination or a bowel movement in the toilet. And this is known as positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is anything that follows a behavior that is likely going to increase that behavior in the future. And it's important to remember that reinforcers can change on a daily basis. They could change on an hourly basis or on a minute-by-minute basis. So what reinforced your child previously may not always reinforce them on future occasions. And that's why it's important to offer choice and control. So if you look at this visual, you can see at the very start, there's I can do my wheeze and poos in the toilet. And then when it says pick a treat, there are options that are being offered. So, an apple, a banana, some chocolate, or a sweet, or whatever else it might be. You can also give your young person options of what they would like to sort of achieve or work for as part of this process. So we also want to begin with giving very, very high levels of reinforcement. So every single time the young person goes to the bathroom and sits on the toilet, they get a reward. Once they've mastered that, we're going to want to begin to fade out the reinforcement and increase the expectation. So it may be that they go into the bathroom and sit on the toilet. And then once they can do that, it's that they go into the bathroom and pull their pants down by themselves and receiving reinforcement for each instance of that until we get to the very end goal, which would be being able to pass a bowel movement or urinate in the toilet. What we are doing in that instance then is we are fading out the level of reinforcement until we get the desired goal. And that's not to say that whenever your child is doing each of the other steps that we don't provide reinforcement. We can just change the type. So instead of it being a tangible reinforcement, such as a sweet or a toy or whatever else it might be, or an activity, we can maybe move down to social praise, such as smiles, high fives, or verbal praise, which can be used as a reward and a little nice acknowledgement that we're really pleased with what your young person has done. So some examples of that may be descriptive praise. So for example, well done for sitting on the toilet. Non-verbal praise, such as a gesture, a thumbs up, maybe clapping, or a nice smile. A favorite activity would be a higher level of reinforcement that could be tangible, so maybe playtime with their favorite toy, reward charts, or maybe a favorite food that they enjoy that will motivate them. So this is just another example of a reward chart, and it is broken down into each of the component steps. So we're looking at those task analysis that we discussed before. So as you can see, visuals can be adapted for use with your child and their individual likes and preferences to help motivate them. So this one is just one with Thomas the Tank Engine. If your young person likes Avengers or Barbie or LOL dolls, they can all be incorporated into their reward charts. So let's think about bowel movements. So bowel movements are associated with being able to poo effectively. Bowel control tends to come after bladder control. Some children do find bowel movements quite frightening because there's a very different sensation that's going through their body and something leaves them afterwards. Some children don't like the splash in the toilet after passing a bowel movement. And some children actually do quite like the comforting sensation of a full nappy. Sometimes for our young people, if they do have a bowel movement in their nappy, we can encourage them to then put their poo into the toilet so that we are beginning with impairing that poos go into the toilet, despite the fact that they've still done it in their nappy. So sometimes our young people do withhold. And you can see here in this visual that a child may have hard or painful stools, and that's why they're withholding, because they don't like the feeling of what happens whenever they try and pass a bowel movement because it's painful. That means that they may then become fearful of repeating the experience of a sore sort of bowel movement or a poo from their past experience. Then they withhold the bowel movement and then they continue to have hard and painful stools. So it's often a very vicious circle. What we would say is to contact your GP to get some advice around stool softening, such as laxatives or alternative measures. Here are some resources that you may wish to think about. So there's some books, social stories, and links that you can look at for your own information and guidance in relation to actually doing the poo and the wheeze. So storybooks can be helpful because they do tend to be quite visual. And there are quite a lot of stories and books about using the toilet or potty, and adding these into your routines when you're going to the toilet or before going to the toilet can help provide information that may reassure an anxious child. We want to think about smearing. So the first thing that we would do is think about the reasons that your young person may be smearing. So they may be feeling unwell or in pain. So a lot of our children may end up putting their hands sort of around their bottom whenever they're having a bowel movement because of the pain. They may be trying to alleviate that pressure or that sensation around their bum. They may not understand where their poo needs to go. So they may not understand that it needs to go into the toilet, or that there's a social aspect of that we don't like it when our hands are covered in poos. They may be reluctant to wipe because the toilet paper feels too harsh, or it's a certain sensation that they don't like. They may be seeking out sensation from the texture of their poos, the smells of it, or the movement of their arms during the smearing action, or how the texture feels to them. It may be their way of communicating that they need attention or trying to get a reaction if they've had a reaction before. Or there may also be a fear of the toilet. What we advocate is to always contact your GP to rule out any medical needs that may be contributing towards smearing first. And that will help us understand whether or not there's a need for medical intervention for any pain or discomfort before we look at behavioral interventions. We would also recommend replacing the toilet paper with wet wipes in this case. So wet wipes are often softer against the skin, and the moisture within the wipes can increase the child's awareness then of where they've been cleaned and which areas may have been missed. We're going to want to teach the wiping process. So many of our children may smear because they don't actually know how to wipe in the first place. And that may be a case of modeling, showing the child how to do it, or moving to a hand over hand approach. So putting your hand on top of their hand as they wipe and fading that back so as they become independent. So maybe you fade it to their wrist, to their elbow, to the top of their arm. For many of our children who like smearing because of the sensory aspect of it, what we would be recommending to do in those instances is to provide alternative activities. So activities that have maybe a similar texture to bowel movement. So things like papier-mâché, jelly baths, gloops, which is just made of corn flour and water, finger painting or Play-Doh, anything that can replicate the sensation that is associated with smearing, and it will give that same sensory feedback or a similar level of sensory feedback. We also want to make sure that we are providing those activities at the times and places where smearing usually takes place. So we want to give it in advance of smearing. So if you know that your child is going to smear as soon as they go to the toilet, and that they have those activities provided to them while you're trying to change them or while you're taking them to the bathroom. And we also want to consider our response to smearing so that it's not reinforcing from a social perspective. So what we would say is to use minimal sort of interaction in those instances. That's not to say that we're going to ignore the child when they smear, but we're not going to react to that behavior itself. So we're going to avoid paying too much attention to the behavior or showing too much of a reaction. We can keep it very simple and redirect the child to get washed and continue to stay calm. Often when a child does have difficulties with their communication, they can feel like any kind of influence that they can get over people's feelings and reactions is a success. And they can then start smearing partly because they know it's a way that they can communicate quite effectively. They can get people to interact with them, despite the fact that other forms of communication may fail. And it's really important that we see this as not seeking attention, but that the child is trying to communicate something. If your young person is smearing quite intensely, we are going to want to block that behavior so that it can't be practiced and rehearsed, because behaviors that are practiced and rehearsed tend to increase and they tend to become more harder to change and more ingrained. We may wish to consider using sort of tighter fitting underwear or tighter fitting trousers so that the young person can't get at their poos. Or if the behavior is occurring maybe at bedtimes, maybe a onesie placed on so that the young person can't locate their nappies or their underwear. We also want to think about what prerequisites are needed for bottom wiping. So some of the prerequisites include knowing when your bowel movement is finished. So we don't want the young person to start wiping before they have finished going to the toilet. They need to know the difference between clean and dirty, so being able to discriminate between what is clean, what is dirty, so that they know once they've finished wiping their bottoms, and if they check the toilet paper, they can see, okay, my bottom's clean versus my bottom is still dirty and I need to keep going. They need to have the bodily awareness to be able to locate their bottom itself. So being able to actually find that is a really important place to start, so that they're wiping the right part of their body. They also need to have the shoulder, arm, and wrist and hand strength and stability required to be able to reach and clean. And oftentimes, many of our children try to reach around and then they fall off the toilet. And in those instances, that's when the handles or supports can be useful, sort of on the wall or attached to their toilet training seat. And they also need to have the strength and dexterity necessary to handle and manipulate toilet paper or moist toilet wipes. When we think about that, that's about using the right pressure, making sure that we have enough toilet paper that we don't go through with our fingers, and being able to move in the correct motions. So we have some bottom wiping stages that we can think about. So stage 1 may be wipe clean games. Stage 2 would be learning which area needs wiping, and stage 3 is then transferring to that skill to wiping your bottom while sitting on the toilet. So wipe clean games can help your child learn the correct wiping technique, learning how to take off the amount of appropriate toilet paper and how to fold it in the right way. They can develop skills in wiping without spreading the feces over the rest of the bum. And it can also help develop that ability to wipe within a target area. And it can also help us develop that questioning that we all do sort of very implicitly as part of the toileting task of cleaning. So asking yourself, is it clean? Do I need to wipe more? Can I stop wiping now? And then learning when to stop. So being able to stop when the bottom is clean, which is indicated by no more dirt or stuff or soap or whatever it is that you want to call it on the toilet paper. We also want to think about learning the area which needs wiping. Ideally, what we would say is this should take place in the bath or the shower. So this involves sort of building the knowledge of where to wipe. So is it my bum cheek that is dirty? Is there a little bit of dirt still on that? Or is it on my actual bum? We want to build their physical skills and wiping in between the cheeks, which is a really important step. And we want to help them make the first step in generalizing from the wipe clean games. And we can help them overcome fear and anxiety with wiping their bottom. And then we want to transfer skills learned to wiping their bottom after going to the toilet. So we want to generalize those skills to the actual toilet so that they can use all of the above skills while sitting on the toilet. We want to reinforce the correct routine, including putting the paper in the toilet, as well as getting the child used to dealing with their own pees and poos, which will be an aim of working towards independence in the bathroom. So here are some of the activities that we can be using for toilet training. So maybe to develop body awareness, we might want to provide a long mirror for the child to dress in front of and to play those body awareness games. So asking them to sort of point to or touch different parts of their body, and both front and back, while looking in the mirror to visually reinforce that physical feedback of touching and figuring out where things go. And then you might want to ask them to touch different parts of their body and ask them to touch the same part while looking in the mirror. So if it's really difficult to achieve that at first, just you can use some guidance for them, maybe touching them with a little sort of like a little spatula or a little pointer, which may help them find the spot. For other children, you may want to use sort of little stickers or little sensory things that you can stick to their correct body parts so that they have an awareness of when they touch it. And obviously that would be attached to their clothes, not their actual body parts. We want to consider encouraging trunk rotation. So, if we think about trunk rotation, that's about being able to turn while you're on the toilet. So activities that may help develop that would be things such as passing objects backwards and forwards to someone sitting in front of them and behind them. And it can be done in a standing position to allow passing an object also between their legs and overhead. So really developing that physical skill of trunk rotation. We may also want to play games such as passing an object like a beanbag, a small soft toy, or a scarf around the body at waist level, firstly in one direction and then in the other. And that will develop those skills of having to reach around with your hand before you would be expected to use toilet paper to wipe your bottom. And if those steps can be achieved without the object being dropped and with reasonable speed, progress then to passing objects around and between the legs in a figure of 8. So you're going through one leg, round the back of it and over the front, and then round the back of the other leg and over the front of it again. We also want to develop their reach and their grasp. So activities and games such as maybe retrieving a scarf or a handkerchief or a napkin tucked into the back of their waistband with either of their hands, and progress then to learning to tuck that back in again, partially at first and then fully. And the reason for that is so that they can get used to tucking their clothes back in and unhooking their clothes or undoing their clothes from their pants or their trousers. We also want to think about teaching tactile discrimination. So games such as Hunt the Object, where the child sits on the floor and feels for objects behind them on the floor without looking and with their eyes closed if possible, because whenever we're cleaning our bottoms, we can't see what's going on behind us. So we're relying an awful lot on our spatial awareness, on our tactile discrimination. So you can do that by placing one object at a time behind them, so that they can just feel and get an awareness of what's going on and continue to experience success. Once they have sort of successfully been able to do tactile discrimination with one object, you can put quite a few objects on the ground and ask them to find a specific one. And they have to move their hand about so that they can find the object that you've asked them to find based on how it feels. We can also play a feel and find game. So that's where we would stick lightweight objects to the back of a child's trousers for them to feel for and pull off. And this is really going to be depending on your child's sensory preferences and tolerance of those activities. What you could do is make it really, really fun. Maybe use a sticky tape or a masking tape or double sort of sided sticky tape. With maybe things like makeup pads, scrunched up tissues, kitchen paper balls, or cotton wool, anything really similar that they'll be able to feel and find that can be stuck to the tape. And what you're going to want to do is start with quite big things that are stuck to the tape and then gradually reduce the size of those objects used as the child's skill develops, and finally using just small pieces of the sticky label so that they're able to really pay attention to what's going on behind them. Because what this is really leading to is being able to clean and wipe your bottom and fully making sure that nothing is left behind. So another important question that we think about is, whether or not, especially for young boys, do they stand or sit? So whether you really instruct your child to sit or stand at the toilet for pees is a family decision based on personal preferences. The other thing that we need to think about for bottom wiping for both boys and girls is that's whether or not they stand or sit to wipe their bottom really depends on a wide variety of factors, and things like such as the size of your child, their balance, their strength, and previous experiences with doing either of those. If you're using an insert on the toilet to reduce the size of the toilet seat, there may not then be enough space for your child to reach down the back while seated. So they may need to shuffle forward or stand to be able to wipe. If you're not using an insert on the toilet and your child is still small, they may not have enough strength to balance on the toilet while holding on with only one other hand and using the other for wiping. So in these cases, it may be preferable to ask your child to stand to wipe. And that's when they can stand with their legs slightly apart and with their knees slightly bent, as this is going to make the wiping more accessible. So what we're trying to do is teach them how to wipe their bottom successfully. Now thinking about toileting in school, so we want to be really aware of literal interpretation of language. So for many of our young people during their toilet training protocols and procedures, often things that can happen is that the language that we use can actually be a barrier. So some of the rules or language that may be used, maybe you can only go to the toilet at break and lunchtime. For many of our young people who are starting this journey, they may not be able to hold for that length of time. So they may need to be told that they can use the bathroom as soon as they feel that need to go. And that there may also need to be planned opportunities for the young person to go maybe on a visual schedule for them so that there's always a reminder. We also want to make sure that if the young person uses one toilet before, that they don't always feel that that's the toilet that they have to use, so that they don't become attached to one toilet or feel that that is the only one that's available to them. We may also want to think about sending different toilet roll or wet wipes to school that mirrors what's being used at home, again, to continue with that level of consistency. For many of our young people where there are sensory sensitivities around noise, the hand dryers may be a deciding factor in terms of success. So we're going to want to find out if school toilets have hand dryers, and if they do, is there another toilet that your child can use if they do have sensitivities to the hand dryers? And if not, is there a way that they can use the toilet at a different time whenever it's free and that the hand dryer is unlikely to be set off? For many of our young people, some desensitization to hand dryers is quite useful so that they can then use any other toilet with a reduced or minimal level of stress and anxiety. We're going to want to have a spare set of clothes in school just for those accidents, so the young person isn't sort of sitting wet or messy for extended periods of time, and so that they can sort of continue to feel confident, especially with their peers. We may need to schedule toileting during quiet times if necessary. So some children don't like to use the toilet when there's other children there. And that could be because there's a fear of the door being opened and the extra noise, or like I said already, the hand dryers may be starting unexpectedly. So it may be that your young person needs to have their toileting scheduled at a very specific time, free from all of those other factors which may impact on their success. And some children can use trips to the toilet to avoid the demands of the classroom, and maybe to avoid work or unstructured times that they find quite stressful. So it's really important that we're aware of why the toilet and trips are happening. And if we know that the work is too hard, that it's sort of reduced. If we know that it's a sort of a motivation issue, we can put in place reinforcers. Or if it's an unstructured time that they find very overwhelming, we can make that more structured. So what we're going to want to do is always work with the school to address sort of the root of that issue. We want to be able to give alternatives to leaving the classroom to go to the toilet, so that the child isn't always using the toilet as an excuse. We want the toilet to be very, very functional for the young person. And we may want to be using then tokens or reinforcers to manage how often they leave the classroom. What I would say is in the early days when the child is toileting, and if this is being taught in school, we're going to need to have a lot of opportunities for them to go to the toilet when they say that they need it, because they may not be releasing their full bladder or bowel movements all at once, and we want that to be successful. Once we've mastered how sort of those key steps in using the toilet and in being able to have a bowel movement in the toilet, and we know that that is very, very secure, we can then use toilet tokens so that the child isn't using a trip to the toilet just to get out of class. And toilet tokens may be tokens that can be used throughout the day, maybe 4 or 5 tokens that the child can use to go to the bathroom, as well as what they would usually get at break and lunch. So at night then, what we need to think about is we want to limit food and drink before bed. And we want to really just take the time for the young person to stop drinking around 2 hours before bedtime. That way that they're more likely to have emptied their bladder and have a successful night in bed without having any accidents. We're going to want to take them to the toilet just before bed. So it's important to maybe keep your child in nappies at night until they wake up dry for several nights in a row. And that would be an indicator to us that your child is able to hold for that duration of time. And it's important not to risk disturbing them. And so a child that's woken to go for a wee to avoid a wet bed is maybe a child who's going to think that it's time to get up and start the day. So we don't want to do that. We want to use our baseline as your child waking up for several nights, after several nights in a row, without any wet nappies. We also want to think about sort of things like using a waterproof mattress or a protector, so that your child isn't feeling uncomfortable when they're lying in their bed. We might be considering a bedwetting alarm to teach your child to wake up at night before the wetting. It'll be also important to keep a set of clean underwear and pajamas close to the bed in case of an accident. And sometimes bedwetting can be a sign of medical issues. So it is important to speak to your GP around this, and there may be an onward referral to the incontinence clinic needed. Thank you so much for listening to the toileting webinar on behalf of the Belfast Trust Child and Adolescent Autism Service in collaboration with Sensations. You will all have received a resource pack with activities in it, in which you can implement some of the strategies discussed in this training presentation. That's the end of the training. You can feel free to close your browser.